In some videos, particularly our civil rights short videos, we sometimes get comments that everyone knows that the Civil War was not fought over slavery. Unfortunately, someone did not inform the leaders of the Confederacy that they did not secede because of slavery, because the fear that slavery would be abolished was exactly the reason why the Confederate leaders gave for seceding from the Union. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we use for this video and related videos. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. After the 7 core states of the Confederacy seceded, and 3 weeks after the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln as presidency, Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, delivered the Cornerstone Speech in Savannah, Georgia. He proudly announced that white supremacy and black slavery was the cornerstone of Southern society, claiming that white supremacy and slavery was based on divine law. The Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens proclaimed, "Our new government's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery and subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based on this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." And he continues, "Our Confederacy is founded upon principles in strict conformity with these laws establishing slavery. The stone which was rejected by the first builders has become the chief of the corner, the real cornerstone in our new edifice. And this is religious imagery, as Christ was proclaimed as the cornerstone of Christianity. Furthermore, the Confederate VP Stephens proclaimed that the new Confederate Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists among us, and the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization." And what did the states give as their reasons to secede in their secession conventions? South Carolina, the first state to secede and the first state militia to fire upon Union troops on Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War, stated in its declaration of secession that the increasing hostility on the part of the non-slave holding states to the institution of slavery. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of the President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Mississippi proclaimed that its reason for seceding was to preserve the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Florida proclaimed that the reasons for its seceding were all related to slavery. The North's disregard for the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, John Brown's 1859 failed slave uprising, and William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass's The North Star tried to excite insurrection and servile war, and lastly listed Lincoln's election as another reason. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act was part of the Compromise of 1850 to hold the Union together. It stated that Northern officials were obligated to return runaway slaves to their masters and was deeply unpopular in the North. And in return, several states were admitted to the Union as free states. John Brown was a fanatical anti-slavery terrorist who captured the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, hoping to spark a slave uprising, except that the surrounding slaves had no knowledge of his plans. Robert E. Lee was the U.S. general who put down the insurrection. John Brown was able to deliver a prophetic oration at his trial, capturing the imagination of many in the North. And Frederick Douglass, a former runaway slave and spellbinding orator whose English friends were able to purchase his manumission, wrote a best-selling autobiography on the brutalities he experienced and witnessed in his life as a slave. Likewise, Alabama seceded from the Union mainly to perpetuate slavery. Georgia likewise seceded from the Union to preserve slavery, its governor asking, "What will be the results of the institution of slavery, which will follow submission to the inauguration and administration of Mr. Lincoln as the president? It will be the total abolition of slavery." Likewise, Louisiana seceded from the Union mainly to perpetuate slavery. Texas also explicitly stated that slavery was the cause for secession. We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race, for themselves and their posterity, and that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. and slavery was the main reason for secession for the other states seceding from the Union. And the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision was another factor sparking the Civil War, and it was all about slavery. Not only had the Confederate States dominated Congress and the presidency in the decades prior to the Civil War, they also dominated the Supreme Court. A major cause of the Civil War was a Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave who sued his master for his freedom, as his master moved him and his family between slave states and free states, and these free states had banned slavery under the Missouri Compromise Law. The Southern Chief Justice Roger Taney held that no Negro had ever enjoyed the rights of a citizen under the Constitution. Negroes were denied the dignity of personhood. Negroes were always property and would always remain property. Negroes were declared by the Supreme Court decision to be so far inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. And this decision applied to free blacks as well as slaves. This decision, which denied that the Constitution gave Congress the right to bar slavery in the territories, enraged public opinion in the North, bolstering the popularity of Lincoln and the Republican Party. When Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he remarked, "So you are the little lady whose little book started the Civil War." This book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was the best-selling book by far in 1852, eventually selling over 1 million copies, galvanizing Northern opinion about the horrors of slavery. This romantic novel was from the point of view of ordinary slaves, and it really promoted the idea that the lives of even slaves should have dignity, that they were not just mere property like cows or horses, that slaves could be the heroes and heroines of a tragic novel, allowing the reader to imagine the horrors of a life bound up in chains, of souls bound up in cruel inequities, of human beings being bound up in a life of unending peonage. To say that upholding states' rights was the true cause of the Civil War is ignoring the truth that the Confederate States saw it as the right of the individual states to uphold the institution of slavery. So states' rights and slavery are really the same issue. Now, OneDream had sponsored an online discussion featuring Professor Gary Gallagher in his Civil War lectures, and I was able to ask the good professor 2 questions. My first question was whether many Northerners suspected that if the North sued for peace rather than calling up troops after South Carolina shelled Fort Sumter, that this would only delay the inevitable Civil War. And the reason war is inevitable is that the two nations would inevitably come to blows over whether newly settled states in the Western Territories would be admitted to the Confederacy as slave states or be admitted as free states to the Union. And Professor Gallagher answered that indeed this was the fear of many informed citizens before the Civil War. My second question was, why were Northern soldiers eager to fight to preserve the Union, which seems to be a rather abstract cause to give the ultimate sacrifice of your life? And the good professor has said that he wrote a book exploring that very question, which we reviewed in a prior video. Northerners were deeply committed to preserving the Union cause. This dominated the politics of American icons such as Daniel Webster and Henry Clay in the many decades preceding the Civil War. Northerners were resentful that the Confederate States seceded after Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. This resentment was deepened by the fact that the Southern states had dominated the government since the founding of the Republic. But to truly understand the depth of these feelings, we need to reflect on the biographies of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, which we plan to do. And there's no denying that the abolition movement in the North was never enthusiastically supported by the majority of whites in the North. Most Northern whites were deeply prejudiced against the blacks, and segregation of the races was nearly universally accepted. But many Northerners supported the Free Soil Party, active from 1848 to 1854, which opposed slavery not on moral grounds, but on economic grounds, since slaves were seen as unfair competition of free white laborers and workers. When the Free Soil Party dissolved, most of its former members joined the newly formed Republican Party. To win the war, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, shared it with his cabinet, and then pocketed the document until the fortunes of war improved for the North. After the victory at the Battle of Antietam and Grant's victory at Vicksburg, Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order issued under his war powers as Commander-in-Chief in September 1862. Lincoln proclaimed that if the Confederacy surrendered by January 1st, 1863, she could keep her slaves. But if the rebellion persisted after that date, all slaves in the rebelling states would be free. This guaranteed that England would not interfere in favor of the Confederacy, since the British were deeply committed to abolishing slavery. This Harper's Weekly illustration shows what the free blacks saw in emancipation. No longer would they be whipped. No longer would they be abused. They could now vote. They and their children could attend school. They could learn how to read, and have a house, and a family in their house, and have a real life of their own. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video and related videos. And this is Professor Gallagher's book, The Union War, which explored the reasons why Northern soldiers were willing to lay down their lives simply for preserving the Union. And Eric Foner is the renowned Civil War historian on the causes of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and his second founding explores the Reconstruction Amendments, which guaranteed all citizens, including freed slaves, due process under the law. He also wrote a very interesting book on the Free Soil Party, which we plan to review sometime in the future, maybe next year. Eric Foner also wrote a very hefty tome on Reconstruction, which we were going to use as a source of a video, but the problem is the history of Reconstruction is the story of how mixed legislatures, black and white, wrote some very groundbreaking laws that were repealed during Jim Crow and were reenacted 100 years later in vastly different form. But he also has some shorter books on Reconstruction. And Eric Foner also wrote the Fury Trial on Abraham Lincoln and slavery. And as you can see up there, we also have purchased several biographies of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. And we really need to reflect on those biographies to truly understand why the Northern soldiers were willing to lay down their lives simply to preserve the Union. Gary Gallagher's book, while helpful, is not complete. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.